Inspiring interviews with today's top landlords. This is the Rental Income Podcast. And now, Dan Lane.
Chris, you never imagined yourself owning rental properties. You really kind of accidentally fell into it. What happened?
Yeah, I never really strongly considered real estate. I just thought that was someone else's thing, not my own. But essentially, my girlfriend owns a hair salon. So she had two stylists that were working at the salon at the time that were going to be removed from the property they were in, no fault of their own. So I figured, I'll just find a house somewhere locally, close to the salon, obviously, that I can just buy and they can rent it from me, easy peasy. So when I went to go look at the property and they're like, oh, by the way, this person's living here. I'm like, okay, well, I didn't really account for that because I'm trying to find someone to live here. So I'm going to have to kick him out. Unfortunately, that's what I'm going through in my head. So when I looked at the property and, he was a real nice guy. He had lived there for a few years. I was comfortable with, what he was paying because I asked him, what he was paying for the property. And he had no intentions of leaving, said he wanted to die there. I'm like, this sounds like a great business opportunity, And, after the first month, I'm like, there's nothing to this. I essentially went to go look for a second house so I can place those same original two stylists somewhere. So then, I started, researching a little bit more on how to, work this whole thing. So I ended up, renting that second house out. So I was like, no, now I have two single family homes. And, within the matter of like 2 or 3 months, I went from never even considering real estate to owning two single family homes rented. And so I kind of stumbled on that matter.
Incredible. And flash forward to today, how many rentals do you have now?
So I'm currently with 7 single family homes. Looking to expand, but at this point, obviously I'm a little more picky about what I'm doing, and I've learned a lot along the way that kind of helps me, process and make those, buys.
One of the things that Chris has learned is that the 1% rule doesn't matter. It's not something he's looking at when he's looking to buy a rental property. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the 1% rule is just kind of a benchmark that a lot of investors use. It says that if you're going to buy a rental property, you want it to rent for 1% of the purchase price. So a property that you would buy for $100,000, you would want that to rent for $1,000 a month. But Chris isn't looking at that. So on the show today, we're going to talk about what he is looking for. We'll talk about what he's buying properties for, what they're renting for, and what he's doing with his monthly cash flow. We'll talk about what he's looking for in a rental property beyond the numbers. And we'll talk about how he owns properties, whether he owns them personally or in an LLC. Joining us on the show today from Tri-Cities, Tennessee is Chris Fontenot. We'll take a really quick break to thank our sponsors. We'll come right back and we'll talk to Chris. There is a ton of paperwork involved when you're getting a mortgage on a rental property. Lenders are going to want to see 2 years of tax returns, pay stubs, bank statements. I mean, it's a lot of work and a huge hassle. Shaylee Ridge from Ridge Lending Group has a brand new loan program where she doesn't care about any of that. She actually doesn't need any paperwork from you at all. She's just going to look at the deal. The most important thing she wants to see is, does it make sense? Is the property going to cash flow? If it does, she'll give you a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Now, the rates are going to be a little bit higher than a traditional full doc loan, but it's still a great deal, somewhere between 3.9 and 5%. She can close quickly and there's no hassle. She can even do a cash out refi with this program. If you want to learn more, just reach out to Shaylee at ridgelendinggroup.com. That's RIDGE lendinggroup.com, NMLS 42056. A good deal on a rental property isn't going to last very long. To win properties today, you need to move quickly when a deal comes on the market, but it takes time to analyze a property. I want to let you know about an app where you can analyze deals on your phone in seconds. It's called Ask Rick, that's RIC for Rental Income Calculator. You can analyze a deal with the push of a button. You can figure out the rent, your mortgage payment, your expenses, and figure out the cash flow. If the numbers make sense, you can make an offer right there on the app, or you can send a calendar invite to your agent to see the property in person. Ask Rick is currently offering a free 7-day trial. Just search for Ask Rick in the App Store or go to Just Ask Rick. That's RIC, justaskrick.com.
Rental Income Podcast.
So, Chris, why don't we start things off talking about your portfolio? Can you tell me what your portfolio looks like today?
Yes, definitely. I really don't like anything under 3 bedrooms, 1 bath. I think that's just that's like the, crossover SUV in the automotive, market. It's just a good, well-rounded vehicle or housing that kind of suits most people's needs. So obviously these acquisitions and people that have been living there are kind of staggered just over the last couple of years, but a blend between older and newer, we're looking at about $1,000 average.
Okay. And what's your average purchase price?
When I started, I wouldn't consider anything over 100,000, but the market's definitely changed. So at this point, I would consider things all the way from anything under 200,000 is really my market now.
Yeah. So it seems like you're close to the 1% rule, not quite exactly at the 1% rule. Is that right?
Yeah. Some of the properties are closer than others as far as 1% goes, but 1% rule is just a general rule, and rules are made to be broken once you understand why they're established in the place in the first place.
So I guess you kind of want to stay close to the 1% rule, but it's not that important if you're a little bit off.
Yeah, I mean, there's other variables to consider. You can't just, paint it with such a broad paintbrush that it needs to follow this thing. Because, I mean, you could buy a cheap house and easily, rent it out for the 1% rule. But, I mean, what if, it needs a lot of work that's coming up? The roof is bad and all these other things that are going to be, very costly, are going to take place. And that's you're following the 1% rule, but you're going to be paying a lot of, profits and capital out to be able to maintain this property versus something that might be let's say a brand new construction. If we want to just be on the opposite side of the spectrum, you might not be at the 1% rule, but I mean, this could be a brand new construction with a home warranty that you're pretty much guaranteed to not have to pay anything out for a long period of time, and that will cash flow way better, even not following the 1% rule, than a property that's a little more dilapidated or is dilapidated that does follow the 1% rule. So there's a lot more variables to it than just, a simple broad paintbrush like that.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. So your properties, are they like quality? Would you say like they're like quality properties that like maybe you would feel comfortable living in?
Yeah, I wouldn't buy a property that I would feel uncomfortable living in. Obviously some properties, wouldn't be my first place that I wouldn't want to live, but I would definitely not have any hesitations about living there. So, generally I look for a certain standard or quality of house. I definitely don't buy anything that's in a rougher area or, that has, poor neighbors or, a bad school zone or anything like that. I want to have something that ultimately is going to appreciate, not just because, it's a good house, but because, it has development, it has a good school zone, it has a good neighborhood that's thriving, and so on and so forth. So those are also things to consider because we're not just looking at cash flow. We're looking at appreciation as well. What equity do you be able to build and maybe even tap into the future to help fund some additional purchases?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really, really interesting point. I think people might give too much credit to the 1% rule as it's something you have to follow or it's not a good deal. Like there really are so many other variables to look at. So I think that's pretty smart. Are prices increasing in your market?
Definitely. I think we can't say every, but every market that I'm aware of, at least, there has been a significant price increase, especially through the last year and a half or so. My market specifically, which is kind of tailors to what I spoke about earlier. When I started in 2017, I wouldn't even look at a house for over 100,000, and now I'm up to 200,000, literally doubled, just to be able to have more properties that are under consideration. The rents have also kind of followed suit with that allows me to cash flow at those price points with the rent increases that we're seeing in this area. When margins are a little thinner, you're going to have to expect that. I mean, it's not to say that you have to play the game every second, there's definitely, it comes in cycles like most businesses, and, housing is the same. Obviously it comes in cycles. So, we're at the end of a cycle or at the peak of it. It's not necessarily maybe the most ideal time to be, aggressive and just trying to add another property to your portfolio just for the sake of doing so, and also you don't want to tap out with your cash reserves or, your finances. I mean, you never know when a good deal is going to come by. I learned early on, not just in real estate, but just in general, when you're, hustling, if you will, you always have to have a decent amount of money set aside that you don't touch. And that's your, I guess you want to call it slang, like your re-up money. You always have to have that money that you can use to make more money. So you don't want to, buy a property that wasn't ideal, wasn't a good deal, only to find out 2 weeks later, the thing that you were waiting for shows up and you're tapped out,
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. And then the other thing too is interest rates. I mean, interest rates are so low right now that, maybe you're paying a little bit more, but you're paying a lot less in interest. So, I mean, I think you got to just kind of take everything in perspective, but just because the market is high doesn't mean that there aren't good deals, like you said. So you just got to maybe work a little bit harder to find them. Now, when you
actually, if I could add to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there was a fishing analogy that someone shared with me that kind of, boils down to real estate very well. And basically if we're all fishing from the same pond, then there's never going to be any big fish, because if we're all hunting the MLS, everyone's in the MLS. There's no chances for fishes to grow big there. But if you kind of diversify your approach and maybe hand out some business cards, word of mouth, talk to people, knock on doors, those kinds of approaches, you can find some really good deals that, people just aren't willing to put forth the effort to present them out there to the public on the MLS. So, I mean, maybe just diversifying on your, the manner you go about obtaining these properties and finding these leads can still let you what you're looking for. You just have to be a little more creative.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Well, let's talk about one of your deals to see what you're buying. So can you tell us about one of your recent purchases?
One of the properties I purchased, which I think is actually a testament to the way that the market's trending, I actually had an opportunity to buy this house sometime in 2018. It was a fresh remodel. It had granite countertops, new appliances, new flooring, roof, all that kind of stuff. Everything you would look for. It's a great deal, in hindsight, 2020, obviously. But it was listed for $86,000 when it was freshly done. And I passed. I was like, man, there's other deals out there that I can find that are better than this. So I passed on it. And, earlier this year, that same property went back up on the market on the MLS for, I think it was like 120 or something like that. I think I paid 118. But I mean, that's a testament to what I was just sharing with you. 2 years ago, I could have bought this property for $86,000. 2 years later, I paid 120 for the same exact
house,
property
right,
with 2 years of wear and tear on it.
Wow. So what changed? Like, why was it not a good deal before, but it was a better deal now? Like, were you just more comfortable with it today, or like what changed with the property?
So the main thing that changed was that the market appreciated, and that allowed me to, charge a rent that was going to cash flow well, even at the additional price point. So I would say that property, if I were to have purchased it in 2018, and that kind of just shows how aggressive this market's been in the last, year and a half. I mean, I might have been able to rent that for maybe $700, maybe $750, something like that. But I'm renting that property out for $1,000 right now, and there's upside to that. Still, I could probably get more for it if I really wanted to and pressed it. And so the additional money that I paid for the property was offset, by the rent that the current market demands.
Now, you mentioned before about how important it is to have reserves. How do you figure out how much is enough? Like, is there a certain dollar amount that you set aside every month, or is there a certain number that, like, once you have it in the bank, like, you feel comfortable? How do you budget for that, or how do you manage unforeseen expenses?
Yeah. So, personal finance is one of those like real specific things to an individual. Some people are a little more diversified with the levels of income and risk and associated with all that kind of stuff. Generally, you're going to know just by the property itself and your home inspection, just doing your own due diligence, what that property is probably going to need in the near term. So you kind of want to budget based on, hey, that water heater is really old. Hey, that stove looks like it's on its last leg, so on and so forth. That HVAC unit's 20 years old and probably it's got another 2 left in it, if that. So, I mean, you want to kind of have a cash reserve based on what's already readily available as far as information. But even if, for example, like one of the properties we spoke about earlier, you have the best, situation where everything's brand new and you don't really anticipate anything, I would still at least budget, $5,000-6,000, or even if you don't necessarily have the money in cash, having the ability to tap into those resources. Like even if you just have a line of credit on a credit card that if absolute worst case, just crap hit the fan, you can at least make it happen. Because if there's a tenant in there, you don't have the option of saying, hey, we'll fix that AC, 3 months from now, or that water heater can wait to, next paycheck for you if you have a W-2 job or so on and so forth. Things need to happen when they need to happen. So you definitely need to make sure you have those resources available to you when it's needed.
Yeah, that is so important, having that money available. And I liked what you said about looking at the property, because every property is going to be different. If you have a property that has a ton of deferred maintenance, that property is going to cost you so much more than a property that you maybe just rehabbed. So I think that's really important to look at the property and figure out how much to put aside. Have you ever been burned where you bought a property that you thought wasn't going to need much work, but it ended up costing you a lot of money?
Well, a lot of money is relative, but yeah, I did have a property that I purchased earlier this year that, it was a fresh rehab, by those, standards, everything was new. I didn't really anticipate spending much money in it. But, at this point in the game, I have enough reserves per property that, regardless of what happens, unless everything just happened all at once, I really wouldn't stress it. So, this individual property ended up costing me about $2,000 or so over the last maybe 4 or 5 months that I've owned it. And this is a fresh rehab. I didn't anticipate these kinds of problems, but knowing that I had the reserves, to be able to handle any of these issues, it's not stress free. I actually enjoy it. If there's a problem and it's easy to resolve, just making a phone call, getting it done, and not stressing about the whole situation because I have the foresight to plan for these kinds of things. It's very minimal stress level.
Let's talk about that property. So when you bought that property, it was freshly rehabbed right before you bought it?
Correct. I don't know what condition it was in prior to the rehab, but it has new flooring, new cabinets, new appliances. The roof was replaced, fresh paint. It looked great. Granite countertops were just installed. I would live there no problem. I would have my family stay there, no problem, but those are the kinds of things you don't see. It was a crawl space, and I don't personally crawl in the crawl space, and my home inspector, I rely on him to do those kinds of dirty jobs. And he did point out a couple things, but you can't really put a timeline on, hey, that pipe's going to burst, or that might be problematic in the near term more than the long term, So your home inspector, he may mean well, but there are ultimately things that he may miss or may misinterpret, or it's just a luck of the draw kind of thing. It's not anyone's fault. No one knew what was really going to happen.
Right. So let's get some details on that property. So what did you pay for it?
It was listed for about $180,000 or so. I ended up agreeing on, I think, 173 with 3% for concessions. Interest rate was somewhere in the low fours, so that nets me a mortgage payment somewhere around $850, $875 a month. Currently rents for $1,400, so we're looking at about $540 or so cash flow monthly.
Okay, and all right, so you've got $550 or whatever a month. What do you do with that money?
Essentially, the way that my whole, business is structured is I have an LLC that holds the properties, and all the rent checks and all the income from rentals goes into a business checking account where all the mortgages are pulled out of from. So essentially, all the money just is funneled into a single account, and I pay the mortgages out of them or any kind of maintenance or repairs that come up. So it essentially just builds.
Okay, so you don't take anything out; you're just building it and saving up for expenses and maybe for a down payment down the road?
The way I structure it, I use my personal finances to secure properties, and I quit claim deed the deed to the LLC once it's closed. Because I don't really use that money to support my lifestyle or anything like that. I really just let the business hold the money. I have a W-2 and other sources of income, so I don't really tap into that money for personal use.
Okay. Do you plan to down the road, like eventually, do you want to pull money out of the rentals, or are you just focused on building the portfolio right now?
So what I would like to be able to do is create a portfolio loan where I'm able to roll all those properties into a single loan and then be able to tap in the equity of that portfolio loan and use that as down payments or to acquire flips, where it's not going to go through the typical loan process because it, needs rehab and want appraised and all those kinds of things. So either have it as a line of equity to be able to do cash buys and flips or cash buys and rehabs and refinances or what have you. But just having all that equity sitting there is, essentially they say equity is where money goes to die. So you definitely want to make use of it if possible, but it's going to be more difficult to access it if they're all in separate loans.
Right. Very true. So you've got every property in a different LLC?
No, they're all in a single LLC. So I just quit claim them all to the same LLC.
If you want to hear more from Chris, I did a bonus episode with him a few months ago. We talked about a pretty interesting strategy he has where he charges prospective tenants to see his units. I've never heard of anyone doing that before, but it's working out great for Chris. If you want to check that out, it came out on November 4th, 2021. I'd like to thank our sponsor today for making this episode possible. It's Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group. If you're looking to buy a rental property, whether you're just getting started or you want to add to your portfolio, the lender that I recommend is Chaley Ridge. She's a nationwide lender, and her specialty is helping investors finance rental properties. She has a ton of different loan programs, and she can find something customized to you for your situation. If you want to find out more or you want to set up a time to talk to Chaley personally, just go to ridgelendinggroup.com. That's RIDGE lendinggroup.com, NMLS 42056. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. If this is your first time here, make sure you either follow the show or subscribe. Different apps have different terminology they use. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, there's a plus button up at the top of the screen. If you press that, you will get notified as soon as new episodes come out. My name is Dan Lane, and this has been the Rental Income Podcast.